credit for this. My idea, our members have said, you know, they want to talk about things that's relevant to their business. There's really nothing more relevant to your business than political trends in the state and what might happen in the state of Wisconsin in November. And so Charles Franklin is a professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He and Marquette Law School have developed the Marquette Law School poll, which is, I think, is in its 4th or 5th year, and it has become the absolute gold standard in polling, public polling, in the state of Wisconsin. If you followed the presidential election, which got an enormous national coverage, the Marquette poll was front and center of most of those discussions, regardless of which channels you prefer, because it is the most credible polling that's out there. They have found a way, they release it quarterly, sometimes a little more frequently than that during the closing weeks of an election, but they have found a way to make it as addicting as possible. So Charles will start at noon on release day, and that's typically a Wednesday, sometimes a Thursday. And for the next 59 minutes, they'll tweet out individual stats from that poll, and it's literally like crack for all the media because they're retweeting this stuff as he's tweeting it out, and the Marquette Law School is tweeting it out, and junkies like me are, you know, waiting for that one stat that we wanted, and it doesn't come till the 40th minute, but we don't move until that stat comes out. So it's they have found a way to make it as exciting and fun as possible, and as I said, it is the gold standard for polling in the state of Wisconsin from a public standpoint. Obviously, each campaign has their own internal numbers, and from time to time, both sides disagree with Charles, and I think he finds some sport in that. Charles and I have been on some polls and panels, or some panels together. We've done some radio programs together, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Charles Franklin to you guys today.
I know I have a clicker here somewhere, so let's find the right pocket and then I'm good to go. Couple of things, thanks for having me. One amendment. I spent 22 years as a professor at Madison, but I had to leave to be able to do this polling.
Right.
So I'm permanently on the law school faculty at Marquette now, which allows me great freedom in doing this. And I have to appreciate the Marquette lawyers, the alumni, who pay for this out of their annual fund contributions. We're not funded by a grant, we're not funded by any organization, and we leave a lot of money on the table by declining to do any research for a fee. So we're in that sense rather protective of the independence, if perhaps not a very good business. I also am really upset that Tim had to leave because I couldn't have paid him to do a better introduction to some of the things I want to mention. And we did not coordinate on this, and I want you to know that, but I'm going to pick up a few things that do touch on elements that I think are interesting as part of his talk, and certainly of interest to this organization. So I'm going to begin with the big point that I think Tim was directly talking about, and that is workforce development. Over the summer, last June, we did a study of the southeastern Wisconsin, Chicago metro, and northwest Indiana region, the 21 counties that we call part of the Chicago megacity. We did a second, actually, day-long conference at the law school in association with the Journal Sentinel on the Chicago megacity and its implications for the state. We published a substantial report based on that, which I've passed on so that you can redistribute it if you wish. But here's the part that was directly relevant in workforce development. We asked questions about a variety of things, including intergovernmental cooperation and conflict, but the job training was something we did, and we did it a little bit differently than the census typically asked the question. So we got a little bit different insight into this. So, who's the most difficult to employ segment of the population? People with lower levels of education. What impact does technical training have on them? There we go. So these are comparing people with less than a bachelor's degree in these 21 counties. I should say we equalize the percentage, so there's 800 respondents from Wisconsin, 800 from the Chicago area, 800 from Northwest Indiana. As it turns out, there are very few differences across the state, so we're just pooling all this together. So if you do not have a BA, so less than a BA, but no technical training, 62% were employed full-time out of that segment of the sample. If you added tech training, 73% were employed full-time. That's an 11-point boost in full-time employment, which seems to me a significant policy achievement. But what if we look at non-whites within that group? Another difficult to employ segment of the population goes from 51% without tech training to 64%, a 13-point boost in full-time employment. And finally, what if we go to the group that suffers the most in the job market these days, and that is with a high school only, with no college or associate's degree? Still looking at non-whites in that group, from 41% full-time employment to 74% full-time employment. The sample size is beginning to get a little small here, but we're still over 100 respondents, so this is a non-trivial result, even with smaller sample sizes. So I think this is an example of how tech training pays off in the workforce for those who can acquire it. Another point that plays off of something Tim mentioned is we asked people in the sample, when you finished your formal education, did you have a clear plan for how to go into the workforce, or did you just take whatever job was available? Half said they took whatever job was available. Half had a clear plan. So if you think of the 18-year-old or 17-year-old finishing high school with no plans for the future, no plans for higher education, further education, and they wake up at 25 or 26 working in a subway and go, geez, what can I do about this? Tech training is a great opportunity for them to move to, and access to technical training for someone who fits that category. They're no longer a traditional student being supported by parents, or they're not likely to be able to return full-time to schooling, and they've got to pay for it in some way. But you can see that the payoffs can be quite substantial, and I think this is an important element. One other thing, it's just sort of remarkable, Tim's mentioned that a lot of people with technical school backgrounds, going to technical school, actually have already had some form of higher education, and we saw that in our data as well. Because the census, and therefore the Bureau of Labor Statistics, almost always asks education as what's the highest level of education you've had? Is it less than high school? Is it high school? Is it some college? Is it a two-year degree? Is it technical training or technical school? Is it four-year college or beyond? We separated those two questions out. Asked how many years of school you had, and separately asked, have you got technical training? When you do that, you do see and appreciate how many people go back for technical training, even with a bachelor's degree, even with an associate's degree. Last little bit of this, we asked whether, where did you get your technical training? 18% said they got it through the union, their union, whatever union they were a part of. Another 22%, I think it was, no, it was 25, said that they had gone to a technical school. But we asked, did your company provide on-the-job training to allow you to move up to a better job? Half said their companies were providing that kind of training on the job. Half, of course, didn't. But those are all routes to acquiring this kind of technical training, especially for that hard-to-reach population that quit schooling at high school, is hard to employ and find employment in a decent paying job, one with any kind of long-term prospects. So this is where I think the notion that technical training could help us alleviate the biggest problems of our hard-to-employ population. And with, at least based on this one study, granted it's one study of one region, but potentially pretty substantial payoffs. So I put all of this up front so that if you forget everything else today, I wanted to make sure that I got this point up. Yeah?
I just wanted to clarify, so when they say on-the-job training, help them move up, were they including apprenticeship programs in that, do you know?
We didn't probe the nature of it, of the training. It was a wide-ranging survey, so we're kind of limited to how much we did in each area. So that's a good question to go back and focus on more. Another would be, what point in their career did they get this kind of training? Is it what I imagined a moment ago, the 25 or 6-year-old Subway employee that needs to go, learn how to do something else? Or are these folks that are really doing it at 18, 19, 20? Should have asked that. Okay. Happy to do it again next time. Good. I think this is something that we will revisit in the future, though, as part of the Marquette poll. Okay, so that was my big tech stuff. I'm going to go pretty rapidly here to make sure that we have plenty of time and Q&A at the end. And, you're a sophisticated group, so I don't think I have to belabor some of these points. But I do want to talk about politics and the role it's playing in the state right now. This is Obama's long-term approval rating from the beginning of his term. You can see the end of the honeymoon. But the thing you should notice is how flat it's been. Don't focus on the little upturn here. That's trivial compared to how flat this is. This is every president since Franklin Roosevelt down here to Obama as of last week. And you can see that Obama's job approval has fluctuated far less than Bush or Clinton or the first President Bush or Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter. Every other president has seen higher highs and lower lows and more dynamics to their approval over time. Why is that? Because these guys love him. 83% approval right now among Democrats. These folks are skeptical, independents, but have also not fluctuated a lot. Flat, and after 12, a drop off, but then flat and a little bit of an upturn now, and these folks aren't really thrilled. Okay? But here's the punchline. Show me on this chart where we killed Osama bin Laden. Undeniably an achievement of the administration that Republicans would be expected to applaud, and there is no hint that they gave him any credit for that. Conversely, where's the rollout of the healthcare exchanges? Absolutely cannot find it on here. What this means is that we are so entranced in believing that our enemy is our enemy and can do no good under any circumstances, and that our friend is our friend and can do no wrong, no matter how misguided or ineffectual or inept they may be. We are simply not apportioning either credit or blame to political leaders these days. It didn't always be like that. This is satisfaction with the way things are going in the country for the president's party and for the opposition party. This is the first President Bush, Clinton, second Bush, Obama. The two lines move in parallel during the Bush administration. Of course, the president's party is more satisfied, more optimistic than the opposition party. But when one goes down, the other goes down. During the Clinton administration, one goes up, the other moves up by as big a magnitude. But when we get to the second Bush administration after 9/11, where there really was across the board positive response to 9/11, once Democratic support started to fall, it flattened. By the same token of what I was saying a minute ago, show me where the Great Recession is on that line. Democrats simply couldn't blame Bush any more than they were already blaming him at that point. So there was no effect of the recession. There was a long-term decline in Republican satisfaction, which incorporates both the difficulties with the war efforts and ultimately the recession. But likewise, in the Obama administration, absolutely no responsiveness at all from Republicans, and only actually a modest trend upwards for Democrats. The point here is that we simply are not rewarding or punishing political leaders to the extent that in the past we did, and that I believe brings a certain level of representative responsiveness, if you will. Because if you're never willing to criticize or turn against your guy, you're not going to have much control over them, right? They can simply count on your support no matter how egregious their mistakes. And likewise, what's the point of doing anything for the opposition if, no matter what it is, it's never going to be well received? So I think this is a dilemma of democracy. It's a side effect of the deep polarization we see in the country, but also here in the state. Though the state is not quite as rigid as this, which may be hard to believe, but it's true. This is good news. Amazon's hiring. They're paying pretty well. They're requiring almost no skills, and they provide payoffs right away, weekly paychecks and benefits. Okay? So this is great news. It shows something about what's happened to the job market. As I drive around the state, I always take note of convenience stores as I stop for gas and whether they're hiring or not. And these days I can't stop anywhere without seeing a hiring sign out. So that's terrific news. I also want to mention just the good news in the big picture in the same way that, again, Tim teed this up. We maybe don't appreciate our goodness. Green is good here. Green is money. Okay? We're pretty green. We're not as green as the East Coast or the West Coast, but on the other hand, you know, we don't have 20,000 a month apartments and we don't fall into the ocean. So there's an upside to our situation. I grew up right here. That's one that's in this bottom category. So we talk a lot about the South and the Southeast and its advantages as a region in the economy, but let's not forget that it comes with a really high price. There is an awful lot of white and very little green in this area. Here's another way to look at it. These are counties with more than 20% living in poverty. We don't have much here. Minnesota and Illinois, Iowa don't have much. Even the hated Illinois has relatively little deep poverty, concentrated poverty like that. Again, look at the South. Look at my home county down here. It's bright red. Okay? So before we launch into critical things, and of course I'm about to become critical, but I think it is genuinely important to pay attention to some of these advantages and keep them in mind as we address deep problems as well. Here's the unemployment picture in the state. We, of course, the gray line is the US, the blue is us. You can see we fell in parallel. This is a bit worrisome, that flat period. We went a full year without seeing a dip in unemployment rates in the state. But the good news is we added jobs during that period. So that actually represents an expansion of the workforce that was fully absorbed into the job market, but not at a rate fast enough to lower unemployment below where it had been. Finally, this last month, which is still unadjusted, but the preliminary number shows a 0.1% downturn. So that's good, and employment looks pretty good. But if we look at the long-term trend in the number of employed people in the state, starting with 1990, so you can see the long haul here, I always have to preface this by saying I am not trying to make a political point, but I want to look at the 250,000 jobs in 4 years and put it in perspective of where the state has been. So this is not to criticize the governor for that pledge, but think about what 250,000 jobs in 4 years means. We're adding jobs at a 62,500 per year rate. Okay? Could that have happened? Of course it could. Tommy and Bill Clinton delivered that. Okay? We added 60,000 jobs a year over that period in the 90s. We actually hit that rate in the late 80s as well, briefly, but it was more brief. But we sustained it for a long period of time, dropped off a little bit, but we exceeded it a couple of times. So in the 90s, we were, as a state and a nation, because of course the national economy plays a role here too, we were fully capable of that admirable goal of very big expansion of the workforce. Then the dot-com bubble burst, and we went through a very long jobless recovery that only started to rise about 2004, when we added 34,000 a year, not just barely more than half of what we had been doing in the 90s. Then the slowdown before the Great Recession, the collapse of the Great Recession. Then the last year of the Doyle administration, the first year that we were out of recession, also the period of stimulus and other things from the government. 31,000 were added, and if we were on course for 62.5, we would be on this dotted line. Where we actually are is the blue line. In the time since January of 11, we've added an average of 36,000 a year. So that's a slight improvement over where we were in these two previous recovery periods. But I think it shows rather dramatically that politics didn't make much difference in this trend line. Right? We changed completely the control of basically every organ of government except the Supreme Court. And yet the job addition rates in 2010 and also earlier are almost the same as what we've seen since. So, you know, I think maybe the governor was right when he said that government doesn't create jobs. But maybe you'd have to worry about whether government policy has really been aimed at creating jobs and what you might do about that, if there is indeed anything to do, except hope for a national recovery that's not as modest as this one has been. We've consistently delivered 2% GDP growth, sometimes 3%. We've touched 4 once or twice, but not the 4 that was consistently delivered in here, and sometimes 5. And if we go back to the Reagan recovery in 03 and 04, we actually had 3 quarters in a row of 7% GDP growth. So earlier periods, we saw much more rapid recovery. You can certainly make good economic arguments about why this would be a slower recovery, but it certainly boils down to a limited growth in jobs in the state. However, really, where we've been for the last 16 years, there's no evidence that over the 16 years of, 3 different governors, multiple changes of legislative control of the different houses, that those rates have been noticeably different since 2000. It's only in that boom time of the 90s that we were really sustaining the growth that we had. This is income, median household income. The blue line's the country. Red, of course, is Wisconsin. That looks pretty good, except it's not adjusted for inflation. And inflation's been delightfully modest, but not zero. Here it is with inflation taken into account. So both the country and Wisconsin have been flat over this period post-recession, with only the most modest evidence of recovery, and a total drop in median household income, whether it's the country or just a little bit higher Wisconsin. We've lost between 8.5% and 9.5% of median family income in real dollar terms. So that does sort of delay consumer spending and the kinds of jobs that are created through faster consumption. We've also had the housing market recover a bit. It had record sales last year, I believe it was. But values are not quite back to where they were, and of course, for the vast majority of homeowners, certainly almost all the middle income ones, that's a big chunk of their wealth. So we've recovered, but we haven't recovered in this metric the way we might. Finally, yet another thing Tim mentioned is population change. See, I told you we didn't coordinate, but. So the purples are the counties that lost population between 2000 and 2010, first decade of the century. And here it is over the last 5 years. So there's a lot more purple here. And it's just where you think it is. It's in the rural areas of the state. If you actually look at the metro areas, La Crosse, where I was yesterday, the Twin Cities suburbs, Wausau, Green Bay, Madison, and the Milwaukee area, that's where we're seeing growth still. A little stronger in some other areas, even compared to the WOW counties. But we are still seeing growth, but it's driven by metro areas, not in the other parts of the state. And if you live up here, this is not a good thing. Now, it's true, not a whole lot of people live up here, but some do. And politically, they represent a non-trivial voice in the state and in the legislature. One might be a little concerned about what attention they feel they're not getting from government and what consequences that could have. Here are people's views of the economy here. This is in our polling data. Looking back over the last 12 months, is the economy better over the last 12 months minus the percent that say it's worse? So above 0 means more people say the economy got better over the last 12 months. Below 0 say it got worse. You can see it's fluctuated a bit. It was mostly negative in 12. It was mostly positive, especially in the run-up to the 14 election. Was a little bit positive right after that, but really fell off in the last year or a little less. Not dramatically so. We're still not down maybe in danger territory, but there is a little bit of pessimism there. When we look to the future, will the economy get better or get worse over the next 12 months? This is what you see. We're much more optimistic about the future than we are about the last 12 months, and that's a consistent pattern. But it's of some concern how much this has been trending down. Still positive, maybe even a little bit of an uptick in the last couple of months, but not the kind of rising optimism that we saw during the 14 cycle or during the presidential re-elect in 2012 either, and the recall. So that's a reason to be a little bit concerned about consumer attitudes here in the state and their optimism. Here's a big change. Wisconsin headed in the right direction. Used to think so, not so sure anymore. Wrong track? Not so much. Oh, goodness. How about the state budget? This is one that's overtly political. Do you think the state budget is better than it was a few years ago, or in purple, or whatever color that is? Gold. Brown. Gold. Worse. In the run-up again to the 14 election, and in the time before that, voters were actually quite convinced that we had addressed our state's budget issues successfully and that things were better than they were. And that changed dramatically last March. Actually, the first data point here is in April, so it's early April. So it's after the budget was delivered. And opinions swapped rapidly and dramatically. And the better has just done nothing but keep falling off. So the idea that every budget is controversial, every budget always has some unpalatable things in it, but once it's passed, everything will be fine. Really, we've not seen that recovery. The worst has fallen off just a little bit. We haven't repeated this question in a couple of months, but we'll certainly come back and monitor it again soon. But you had one job to do, and that was fix the budget problem, and it doesn't look like you did that. And more people think that. Governor's job approval also took a big hit, but that was the combination of this negative view of the budget and the presidential run. And this is where things are a little different from the charts I showed you about the presidency. Where did the governor take the biggest hit? It was actually among the Republicans who didn't like that he was running for president. Now you might think, oh, both of them? But no, in fact, this was 34% of Republican identifiers in the state. And he suffered his biggest drop, 27% drop in job approval among that group. Among independents, it was not as big, though it was more widespread. There are a lot more independents that didn't care for the presidential run either. But this group will come home. These are Republicans. As you start to get a politicized election year and people think in partisan terms, Republicans are going to find all reasons to come back to their governor. That makes perfect sense. And so this little bit of an uptick you see here from 38%, 39% approval to 43% approval now is fueled in part by the coming home of these guys. And this will be good news. I think if nothing else changed, would expect over the coming year to see the governor's job approval rise into the mid-40s or something like that, based just on the group. But the wide open question is what happens among these independents. I'm not showing you Democrats why, because they can't fall any lower, right? They are the mirror image of what we saw with Obama, so negative about the governor that they just can't fall any lower. But by themselves are powerless to change anything because they don't have a majority. Manufacturing a majority requires winning some of these folks. So, okay? Presidential race, the big takeaway here is how much we are not going to like our candidates no matter who they are in the fall. Okay? You cannot like her by 18 points, or you cannot like him by 25 points, or you cannot like this guy by 36 points. Okay? More unfavorable than favorable in each of these. You can see that Clinton really has suffered a decline from being positive down into negative territory. It is fueled in part by Republican antipathy. Something you almost would not believe, or at least I had to be convinced, is Republicans in the state dislike Hillary Clinton more than they dislike Barack Obama. He has an 87%, 88% disapproval rating, or net negative, unfavorable view among Republicans for Obama. It's 93% for Clinton. So a caution here is when we see these negative numbers for Clinton, it is important to realize that they're being driven by the polarization of the parties and the extraordinarily high levels of unfavorability among Republican identifiers. The winner of this election will be driven more among independents. Democrats still have a very positive view of her despite the battle with Sanders, and so that's something to keep in mind. Ted Cruz, though, has been net negative all along and has fallen off during the active primary season. Trump actually rose for a while relative to where he started, but has also fallen off in net favorability. And he suffers net negative favorability, or at best a break-even point among Republican identifiers. So that's the big concern come the fall for Republicans of would either of these be strong candidates. If you look at the presidential race, Clinton leads by 5 over Cruz. She leads by about 8 over Trump. Now, whenever there's a Republican nominee, which probably is going to be September, October on the 137th ballot, we'll expect to see Republicans come home to that nominee. That always happens. The only question is, how deep will the divide be? What will the never Trump folks do? Will that have any impact in November, or will it be a devastating impact? Only the conventions will help us answer that. Here in the state, though, Clinton and Cruz are tied. That's actually a surprise, because normally we're more Democratic than the average state, and yet here the race between the two of them has been dead tied in the last 2 polls, and was virtually tied in the poll before that in January. But the lead over Trump is more substantial, and if he is the nominee, the consequences of this statewide, I'll leave for Bill to answer. Yeah, we have an open seat, but there's no way the House flips no matter what you're reading in Politico. This seat, the 8th, is interesting. Obama won the 8th in 2008 when he was winning the state by 14, but he lost it by 1 percentage point, 2 percentage points, 51-49, in 2012 when he won the state by 7. So if you're just doing the back of the envelope calculation, a Democrat would need to win the state by about 8, 8.5 for the 8th to be dead even on the presidential ballot. And then the question is, how much do coattails and party line voting affect what might happen in the House race? I'm going to skip that. It basically says, it used to be the Democrats had a big advantage. They could get half of the House for just 48% of the vote nationwide. That's a nice little bonus. But in the period since 1994, the Democrats would have to get 51% of the vote to get half of the House. And they've only gotten over 50% of the vote in 2006 and 2008, and just barely in 12 and 96. So they haven't come close in this new regime in which Democrats suffer the disadvantage that they used to enjoy as an advantage. To put that in a slightly easier to see way, Democrats used to get about 10% more seats than they had votes. And after 94, Republicans have gotten initially about 5 to 8% more, and now they're flirting with getting 10% more seats than votes as well. So the shoe's definitely on the other foot here with 94, the Gingrich Revolution being the dividing line between party advantage. Redistricting may play a role in this, but it's certainly not the only reason why we see this change, because the change came in the middle of a districting cycle. It didn't come immediately after, say, the 92 redistricting. Oh yeah, there's this Senate issue. Here, the concern for Republicans is they got more seats that are toss-ups compared to the Democrats. If you put the two together, the leans and the lanes, Democrats need to pick up 4 Senate seats plus win the presidency and therefore the vice president's tie-breaking vote, or win 5. Well, there's 7 here. If you gave them each a 50-50 chance, that would give 3.5 to the Dems and 3.5 to the reps. You'd have 2 Dem seats, so half of that is 1 seat that the Dems would hold and 1 that they'd lose, and therefore they'd fall just barely short of a majority even with the presidency. On the other hand, if this is not a particularly good year for Republicans, you could say these are better than 50-50 pickups for Dems, and these are less than 50-50 losses for Dems. And you can see how easily you could tip that over. But it'd be close. The irony is this should be a great year for Republicans. The party has only managed to hold the presidency for a 3rd term once since World War II, and that was the first President Bush in '88. And going into that election, we had a 4.2% GDP growth in the year, and we had a president with a job approval rating of 56 or 7%. Right? Neither of those 2 things is going to be true this year. So on the face of it, this was a great year to be a Republican running for president. Isn't the world full of irony? And we have a tight race here, or one that tightened a bit. Feingold has run a pretty consistent 10 or 11 point advantage. It tightened once last summer, and now it's tightened again in this last poll. We'll have to do another poll to see whether it stays tighter or whether it expands back. But I expect a competitive race here. And certainly if we saw a Cruz versus Clinton that was tied the way the data showed earlier, then this could be a very competitive race. On the other hand, if it's a presidential blowout, then Senator Johnson will have to work especially hard to recover from this. I want to finish up real quickly, but I got to show you a couple of things that are stunning to me. This is in our last day. What I'm trying to show you here are the divisions between the parties. Okay? This is trade, free trade. Has free trade been generally a good thing for the U.S. or generally a bad thing for the U.S.? And Republicans are more opposed to free trade. Democrats, by a 1-point margin, are more favorable to free trade. And I thought, oh my God, we messed up this question. We didn't. If you go to Pew data at the national level, that's exactly what the Pew data show as well. If you go to the exit poll here, Tuesday 2 weeks ago, these numbers in the exit poll are within 2 percentage points on every one of these 4 categories as our numbers are. Okay? This is the state of public opinion. So it's very interesting to note that Senator Feingold, who's so critical of free trade, is actually appealing to the Republican-based voter. I'm surprised, but it's an innovative strategy. But it is quite striking. The party that used to favor free trade now has voters that, by a significant margin, don't. And Democrats, where you might expect the Feingold approach to criticizing NAFTA and TPP, doesn't actually meet with majority approval within his own party. And that, again, is sort of striking and kind of surprising. What elites in both parties believe may be quite different. Right? But certainly in terms of public opinion, this is not, your granddaddy's Oldsmobile. I'm going to skip the vote for the most part, except to simply point to Trump, who does really well among that majority of Republicans who are skeptical of trade. And on the Democratic side, that it's Sanders that does well. If you tell this story, if we tell it in the Democratic side, I'd probably call these liberal or progressive issues. If I tell it on the Republican side, I'd probably call it populist issues, right? I'm not quite sure how the same policy could be populist in one party but progressive or liberal in the other. But it does show that the divisions we're seeing here often favor Trump on the Republican side and favor Sanders on the Democratic side. The difference being that more liberal, or if you must, progressive or populist view, is more likely to be the majority view in the Democratic side and the minority view on the Republican side. The caveat there is I showed you the one real exception to that, where the anti-free trade is the plurality position for Republicans. Tim also mentioned immigration, right? And here I think the punchline should be, my goodness, even among Republicans, only 1 in 4 favor a deportation policy. 74% favor some path to permanent residence, with more actually favoring a path to citizenship than just a kind of permanent guest worker or green card or something solution. Here, political leadership is dominated by the force of this group within the party, as you can tell from the presidential campaign trail. But it really doesn't represent the views of most Republican. These are primary voters. These are people who voted in the Republican primary last 2 weeks ago. Democratic side, there's really just no differentiation. Everybody there is pretty much for path to citizenship. Trump did better among the deportation side, no surprise. And there's no variation there. Here's the thing about taxing the wealthy. Surprisingly, 1/3 of Republicans are willing to tax the wealthy to reduce inequality, but most are very opposed. Democrats are just lopsided. So this is going to constrain the Democrats because it is such a unanimous position. This, though, represents a bit of a minority within the party, but not a trivial minority. If Democrats could ever figure out how to appeal to these folks, they could make some inroads on this. And it certainly goes to the issue of opposing every tax increase for anyone of any wealth, because that argument does face opposition even in the Republican Party. Trump wants to tax the wealthy, go figure. Sanders, yeah, no surprise there. But do you want government to act to reduce inequality? And that 34% here has dropped to 14%. The problem is government solutions, which are enormously unpopular on the Republican side, even when the policy goal of reducing inequality was at least getting 1/3 support. It just falls off the table when government has to get involved. So we need private enterprise to redistribute income, I guess. And on the Democratic side, there's large support for it. And again, you're seeing the same things for Trump support. Are profits shared equitably among employees through fair wages? Or are wages squeezed in order to provide return of value to shareholders? Republicans think they are shared equitably, Democrats not. This is more a classic divide between the parties. Trump does better among those who think squeeze pay. Sanders does better among those who think squeeze pay. Is hard work enough for a decent life? Big support for Republicans, but moderate majority of not enough among Democrats. Again, the classic liberal conservative divide here. And again, Trump ties into that populist notion that hard work's not enough anymore, and does Sanders. This is kind of neat because Is your financial situation pretty comfortable, or are you either struggling or just getting by? There's almost no difference between the parties here. And this reflects something we saw last summer in the Chicago study as well. What we found in the Chicago study was that people's actual life circumstances hardly differ by party. Now, that's not to say there aren't any income differences or educational differences, but like this, are you comfortable or just struggling or just getting by? Very little difference. In Chicago, do you take public transit like the train or the bus? Almost no difference in the rate of Republican and Democratic ridership, but gigantic differences in whether you want to pay for more mass transit. Almost identical levels of commuting and distance of commute, but dramatically different views on whether you want the state to spend more on highways. So our objective circumstances are often really not different across the party lines, but are really different when it comes to the opinions we have about what we should do. And I think I'll quit there. That's basically the end in any case. You have the slides and they can be redistributed as needed.